The Boston Bruins let yet another third period lead slip away last night to the Minnesota Wild, eventually tying it but losing in overtime. We're going to discuss that game, what Jim Montgomery had to say about Jake DeBrusk afterwards, and take a look back in the history books at the legendary Raymond Bourque here on today's episode of Locked On Boston Bruins.
You're Locked On Bruins, your daily podcast on the Boston Bruins. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome back to the Locked On Boston Bruins podcast. I'm your host, Ian McLaren, and this is a daily show where we discuss all things Spoked B. Today is Wednesday, December 20th. And on days after Bruins losses, we wear Pooh Bear for the comfort. I want to thank you so much for making Locked On Bruins part of your daily routine, free and available on your favorite podcast app and on YouTube. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. New customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That's $150 if your team wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Before we dive into last night's game, quick reminder, you can find the podcast on X and Instagram at Locked NHL Bruins, and you can find me, my hockey thoughts and dad jokes at Ian C. McLaren. All right, it was a back and forth affair last night between the Minnesota Wild and the Boston Bruins, but for the sixth time, I believe, this season, they lost after having the lead following the second intermission. 5 of those 6 losses have come in overtime, and the latest was last night against the Minnesota Wild, a game that they lost the lead in the third period, but also were able to come back, tie things up, and push it to the extra frame. And I mean, this one isn't as egregious as past overtime losses where they had a lead and coughed it up. They had a 1-goal lead heading into the third period. The Minnesota Wild are a very talented offensive team. And most notably at the other end, Marc Andre Fleury put in a legendary performance and really kept his team in the game and gave them a chance to win. As did Linus Ullmark. Let's not take away from his performance. But at the same time, Marc Andre Fleury was so stellar in net for the Minnesota Wild and was really a big reason why they were able to come back and were able to get that win in overtime. It was a 43-30 shot differential in favor of the Boston Bruins. And again, they were winning heading into the second period, or after a buzzer beater goal by David Pastrnak, literally with less than a second to go in the first period. Then later on, it was Kirill Kaprizov who tied it up. There was no scoring in the second period. Kirill Kaprizov tied it up. Ryan Hartman put the Wild ahead with less than 5 minutes to go, and then Brad Marchand scored on the power play from Morgan Geekie and Pavel Zacha. So yes, they allowed the Wild to score a couple goals in the third period to take the lead. Yes, it's a blown lead, but you have to take into account the fact that the Bruins were peppering the Wild with shots. They outshot Minnesota 18-12 in the third period, 16-7 in the second period. That's 34 saves made by, or 33 saves made by Marc Andre Fleury over the final 2 frames to keep his team well in it. The Bruins have now been to overtime quite often in the past handful of games. And, head coach Jim Montgomery, we'll talk about what happened in overtime in a minute. But the Bruins got some great looks. Marc Andre Fleury was vintage, was reading it well, really agile, going left to right, per Jim Montgomery. And the Bruins got a huge boost as well from the fourth line. And this is kind of where I have a bit of an issue with Jim Montgomery last night. The fourth line, such energy. John Beecher with a great defensive play, and then on the rush to help set up a David Pastrnak goal. You had Jacob Lauko dropping the gloves and then almost pulling off the Michigan. You had Oscar Steen with a big hit behind the net. Probably Jacob Lauko's best game of the season. The other two played very well also. But then in the third, they had very limited ice time, and you saw, as has been the case in recent games, where they can't hold the lead in the third, and perhaps shortening the bench may not be the wisest thing in that situation, especially when these guys are bringing so much energy, so much to the table. Let them stay out there and let them cook. Beecher did end up with 10-10 in terms of ice time, but Lauko only 8:39. I mean, part of that was because he was in the box for 5 minutes, but Steen only 9:23. He had 3 hits in that time, and Lauko with 1 hit to go with the 5 penalty minutes. 14 shifts for Lauko, 16 for Steen, 17 for Beecher, and only 18 as well for Jake DeBrusk and Danton Heinen. So they're really going top heavy in this one. Charlie McAvoy came back, played great. Pavel Zacha up front played great, but they really could have used that energy in the third period as well, even for a couple shifts, just to get them out there, get them banging, and put Minnesota back on their heels instead of pressing. Yes, indeed, Charlie McAvoy did return to the lineup. He had 24 and a half minutes of ice time. There was a bit of rust there as well, but shouldn't take him long to shake that off. Pavel Zacha returning from injury. He had 2 assists in the game to go along with 3 shots, a hit in 21 minutes and 7 seconds of ice time to rank second among Bruins forwards there. So a great return from Pavel Zacha. Pretty solid from McAvoy as well, although I expect him to get better as things go on. So yes, it was a blown lead, but the shortened bench didn't help, and neither did Marc Andre Fleury, who thwarted the Bruins at every attempt, except for them tying it, thankfully, and getting the point from the Minnesota Wild. Now we'll discuss overtime and what head coach Jim Montgomery had to say about Jake DeBrusk, specifically leading into a conversation about Jake DeBrusk's future more generally here as the podcast continues. Sleeper is the place you want to be to play daily fantasy hockey. Sleeper is the official daily fantasy app of the Locked On NHL Network. It's our number one choice for daily fantasy sports because with Sleeper, you can win 100 times your cash in daily fantasy hockey contests. All you have to do is pick whether studs like Connor McDavid or Nathan McKinnon will record more or less than their sleeper projections for goals, assists, or pick a goalie and go with saves. To win that 100 times bet on Sleeper, you need to correctly predict the outcome of 8 player stats. So you heard me, Bruins fans. You can win 100 times your money playing daily fantasy hockey with Sleeper. So start paying attention and nail your picks so you can start winning big. Use promo code LOCKEDONNHL to get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions do apply, but use code LOCKEDONNHL on Sleeper. See their terms of use and details on locational availability. Thank you so much once again for making Locked On Boston Bruins part of your daily routine, free and available on your favorite podcast app and on YouTube. And speaking of YouTube, Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with local experts from Locked On, local shows, and national shows covering every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. All right, let's talk about Jake DeBrusk and the comments made by Jim Montgomery following the overtime loss to the Minnesota Wild at TD Garden. Now, I should add, the Bruins blew a third period lead, but so did the Minnesota Wild. And that's why it got to overtime. The Wild were up 3-2 with less than 5 minutes to go, took a penalty. Brad Marchand tied it up to push things to overtime. But it was in overtime that a Jake DeBrusk shot attempt widely missed the net, and it sprung a Wild 3-on-1 the other way that ended up in the back of the net. Jim Montgomery said, "You got to get that one on net." Did not like the shot selection. It sailed wide of Marc Andre Fleury. It was gobbled up by the Wild back the other way. And he said he didn't like both guys going to the net, including Jake DeBrusk, going all the way to the goal line. That's what gives up the 3-on-1 the other way. 3-on-3, the game management wasn't great, said Montgomery. They had full possession. They lost it 40 seconds, with a careless pass, not a tape-to-tape pass, and then they had possession. And then they came back the other way and won it. So Jake DeBrusk kind of called out there for that missed shot and also kind of dogging it on the way back, taking a wide turn, skating back, not helping out defensively, although he could have been a little gassed by that point. But it all exacerbates the reality that DeBrusk is not having the most productive season so far. 29 games played, 4 goals, 7 assists for 11 points, and he's on pace for the worst statistical season of his career. Back in 2021, the COVID-shortened season, he appeared in only 41 games. He had 5 goals and 9 assists. So over the course of 82 games, you get 10 goals, 18 assists there for 28 points. He's currently on pace for 11 goals and 19 assists. Now, he is getting some shots on goal. He's got 65 to date, which is, let's see what my math is here, 65 divided by 29, 2.24 shots on goal per game. And his shooting percentage is currently only 6.2%, which is well down from his career average of 12.4. So if he was able to get, back to his career mark, he'd have 8 goals currently and would be on pace for 20 plus, 22 goals, let's say. So he's getting pucks on net, but they're not going in. It's a bit of a case of poor puck luck. He's also not getting prime power play time. He's got 1 power play goal, 0 power play assists. Last year, he had 14 points on the power play. His ice time, however, is up. He's getting 17 minutes and 7 seconds of ice time on average, and that's up from last season where he got 16:46. Is it a case of not having Patrice Bergeron around? Obviously, he helped turn things around for DeBrusk following that, public trade request. Things were looking very bleak, and he got placed on the top line with Marchand and Bergeron, and things really turned around. He stayed there for the majority of last season as well. This year, he's kind of been bounced around a little bit, and last night he played mostly with Charlie Coyle and Danton Heinen. So obviously a bit of a step down there in terms of line mates. He's not perhaps the kind of driver we would like to see him be, not really creating things on his own. His 0.38 points per game, just slightly higher than what he had in 2020-21, where he was at 34 or 0.34. Now, yes, part of that is line combinations. Last season, Marchand, Bergeron consistently. This year, he's been playing with Matt Patra, Danton Heinen, Marchand, Coyle, Geeky, some turns with Zacha and Pastrnak, just all over the place. So perhaps it's partly being bounced around, not only line by line, but also side to side. And not having Bergeron there, of course, is a big factor. It is a contract year for Jake DeBrusk. So maybe the Bruins try to get something done right now when his numbers are low, or maybe they say, oh, we need to wait and see how this all comes together. They look at the underlying numbers, which are still pretty strong. He's getting attempts, he's getting shots on goal, but it's just not going in for him at the moment. Will he heat up? Well, the Bruins certainly need him to if they're going to have any sort of success over the course of the remainder of the season. But certainly Jim Montgomery was not pleased with his shot choice there, and not pleased with not necessarily dogging it, getting back, but taking a route which was longer to get back and not getting the best offensive opportunity and not setting his team up to have help on the back end either. It's a DeBrusk dilemma. Do the Bruins look to move him as a pending unrestricted free agent before the deadline without some draft picks coming up? Or do they see him as a core member of the team that they want to lock up and see his underlying value? Something that Don Sweeney is going to have to answer for here in the coming weeks and months. One Bruin we know legendary status is Ray Bourque, and I want to dive into the history corner here as the podcast continues. As the weather gets colder, the deals on FanDuel are heating up, and you want to get in on the NFL action this coming weekend because new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 money line bet. That's $150 if your team wins. So if you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get in on the action. Their app is so easy to use, and there's a wide range of betting options, not only for the NFL, but also for NHL and NBA, like spreads, player props, over-unders, and a ton more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get in on the action this NFL, NHL, and NBA season. FanDuel is the official partner of the NFL. It is the Boston Bruins centennial, and from time to time, I've been diving into the history corner with the help of this book, The Bruins, by Brian McFarlane. And, you know, I've seen Ray Bourque around a little bit over the course of the centennial celebrations, and he was one of my favorite Bruins growing up, without question. Cam Neely was my guy, but Ray Bourque, you know, unbelievable. And I wanted to read Bourque's stats are truly awesome. This chapter here from Brian McFarlane. He writes, when the Boston Bruins selected Raymond Bourque 8th overall in the 1979 entry draft, they had no idea he would score more goals and points in the next 2 decades than superstar offensive defensemen like Bobby Orr, Brad Park, and Larry Robinson. But they knew they had a phenom when he set a record for points by a rookie defenseman and became the first non-goaltender in NHL history to win the Calder Trophy and a first-team All-Star berth in his initial season. In 83-84, he became only the sixth defenseman in league history to score 30 goals in a season. And the following year, he won his first team scoring title. In 85-86, he played his 500th game, scored his 500th point. A year later, he won his second team scoring title and led all NHL defensemen in scoring, finishing 10th overall. He captured his third team scoring title in 87-88. Can you imagine in this day and age a defenseman like Charlie McAvoy leading the Bruins in scoring? It's not going to happen anytime soon. In 88-89, despite missing 20 games with a knee injury, he became the seventh defenseman in league history to score over 200 goals. Early in the season, he scored his 700th point several weeks before playing in his 700th game. So at that point, he was averaging better than a point per game. The accolades go on here. 93-94, he led all defensemen in scoring despite missing 12 games and was on the ice for 79 of Boston's 80 power play goals. In 94-95, he led the league in shots and became the second defenseman and seventh player in NHL history to record 900 assists. He collected his 1,200th point that year as well. In 95-96, he hit the 20-goal mark for the 9th time in his career, and he's a defenseman. Named MVP of the All-Star Game. 96-97, became Boston's all-time leading scorer with his 1,340th point. Became only the fifth player in league history to reach 1,000 career assists, joining Wayne Gretzky, Gordie Howe, Marcel Dionne, and Paul Coffey. At that point in his career, his points per game average, 1.06, was better than Gordie Howe and Stan Mikita's. In 97-98, he played his 1,300th NHL game, recorded his 1,400th point. He scored 10-plus goals for the 19th consecutive season. Oh my gosh, just unbelievable. And in a fascinating duel that's been overlooked by the media with Paul Coffey, he was in that duel for the title of hockey's highest scoring defenseman. As both men near the end of their careers, they opened the 1999-2001 season tied in career goals with 385. Bourque's amazing stats guaranteed him a spot in the Hockey Hall of Fame. He was rewarded for his exploits with lots of hardware, Calder Trophy, 5-time Norris Trophy, and of course, he ended up winning the Stanley Cup as a member of the Colorado Avalanche. And when it comes to NHL all-time scoring defenseman, he is right up there with the very best. In fact, he is number one, 1,579 points. Paul Coffey second at 1,531. Is anybody going to come close to that? Brett Burns is the only active defenseman. He's at 852. Erik Karlsson, 783. It's going to be a while until that is broken, unless maybe Cale Makar, really goes on an all-time run here and is able to stay healthy. In terms of Boston Bruins scoring leaders, he remains at the top of the list. Patrice Bergeron is the only guy who's come close recently at 1,040, which is well shy of the 1,506 set by Ray Bourque. Brad Marchand next up at 889. David Pastrnak is at 606, so he needs another 900 points in order to catch Raymond Bourque, which is pretty insane. So some love for Ray Bourque here on today's podcast. Tomorrow we'll be back to do our weekly cup check and bring you all the latest on the Boston Bruins. I hope you are all doing well. I hope you are taking care of yourselves, taking care of each other, and we'll talk to you again here on the next episode of Locked On Boston Bruins.